And so, looking at the slide, today we are going to be focusing on the topic of business ventures and the topic of presentation of information and data response. So what you need to know is as follows.
Grade 12's, what you need to know for presentation of information is verbal format versus non-verbal format. The factors that must be considered when preparing for a presentation, and that is before the presentation. Factors that must be considered by the presenter while presenting, and that would be during the presentation. How to design a multimedia presentation and include visual aids. How to respond to questions in a non-aggressive and professional manner. How to handle feedback and amend plans, and that would be after the presentation. And then decisions for future improvements based on feedback from presentations, which is also after the presentation.
And so, learners, let's look at the types of presentations that one has. Ms. Stein, would you like to enlighten us?
Okay, so for presentations, there are two types of presentations. The first is verbal, and a verbal presentation is an oral presentation where we're going to use words to deliver a message to a group of people, compared to a non-verbal presentation where the presentation or where the information is conveyed to a group of people by using print or other electronic media. For example, if you're using handouts, slides, video clips, and charts.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Stein, for that very detailed explanation of the types of presentations. And so, learners, now let us focus on the slide, the next slide, which says, outline or explain the factors that must be considered when preparing for a presentation. And so in brackets again, you will see the word before, and you will also note that at the start of this particular section, there are two words, doing words, outline or explain. Now, learners, this simply means that a question can be posed on this particular topic. And so when you see the word outline, it merely means that you need to list the facts. When you see the word explain the factors, it now means that you have to list the fact and also give added information. Ms. Stein is now going to share some of this information with us.
Okay, so before your presentation, grade 12, and remembering that presentation should be very, very familiar to you. You've done the same topic in grade 10, you've done it in grade 11, and now it's a repeat in grade 12. And also throughout your schooling career, you've done presentations during English, during business, in Afrikaans. So this specific topic would be very, very familiar to you. So what do we do before we even do the actual presentation? You need to decide on the purpose of your presentation. So you write down your purpose, and then you also write down or you list your objectives of that presentation. Next, you need to consider your audience, right? So you need to determine beforehand who you will be presenting to. Also, you need to determine what the audience already knows. Then you have to write out your presentation. But seeing that we're using technology, some people use their cell phones to plan for the presentation. Some people use their laptops to plan. Some people even voice record all the ideas that they want to include in the presentation. So you write out your presentation, you introduce a topic and give pointers to what you are doing and going to say, to what you're going to say. Then also think about visual aids and how these visual aids will help you as the presenter to get the points across more effective and memorably.
Yeah, and also the visual aids can enhance the presentation at a later stage by just reinforcing the information. Okay, let's continue.
Okay, then also think about creating visual aids. So it will help you, again, to get your message across more effectively. And the visual aids you can use would be the data projector, visualizer, interactive whiteboard, and handouts.
And at this stage, Ms. Stein, it's important for the learners or for the presenter to consider which of these visual aids is the most appropriate method or the most appropriate visual aid to enhance their presentation? What would you say to that?
Of course, you need to think about your audience, what the size of your audience is, what you like, what you think is going to bring your message across the best way. Okay, then practice the presentation alone. So in front of the mirror, if you can, time beforehand the duration of your presentation. If the presentation is too long, shorten the presentation. And of course, if it's too short, then you would lengthen that presentation. Okay, practice in front of somebody. So I use my 10-year-old son to practice in front of. I don't always think he's the best because he finds it very funny and entertaining. So when you practice in front of somebody, practice in front of someone who will give you an honest opinion of the presentation. Let the person measure the presentation against the purpose and the objectives you have identified earlier.
And that's important just so that you ensure that you are on point when you do your presentation.
Of course.
Okay.
Okay, then visit the venue. When you are presenting, sometimes it's a place that is unfamiliar to you. So just to know about the surroundings and everything that you need if it's there, visit the venue, ensure that visual aids are appropriate for the venue, and then also ensure that the equipment provided is working and suitable.
Yeah, that is a very good point. There's nothing worse than having to do a presentation and walking into the venue with your audience can be very intimidating. Yeah. And speaking of which, we don't seem to have any visitors on WhatsApp as yet. So let's just remind the learners quickly as to the WhatsApp number, and if we can just go to the white sheet again. So all learners tuned in, the WhatsApp number again is 083 792 1239. Please ensure that we hear from you. Feel free to WhatsApp us. So let's continue with our presentation, and at this point, let's consolidate with a question. And so this is a section B question. It's a scenario-based question, and scenarios can appear both in section B as well as in section C. But for now, this is a section B question, and learners, it's important to pay attention to the instruction as well as to the actual scenario and questions. A little hint, it's always nice to look at the question before you go and read the scenario. And so this question is going to ask you or require from you to quote 3 ways from the scenario in which Ella can respond to questions after her presentation. So now we know we're going to have to quote. And we have to quote 3 ways. So let's look at the scenario, and that already has now alerted us to what we need to look for in the scenario. So Ellis presented her sales figures to various stakeholders. At the end of her presentation, she ensured that no member of the audience dominated the discussions. She apologized for making the error in her presentation and acknowledged good questions. So learners, that was the scenario. The question now is, quote 3 ways from the scenario in which Ella responded to the questions after her presentation. And so, Ms. Stein, since we have no inputs coming in from the WhatsApp line yet, let's quickly go ahead and look at the answers for this particular question.
Okay, so we're quoting 3 ways from the scenario, grade 12s. It's coming directly out of that scenario. And it says there, at the end of a presentation, she has ensured that no member of the audience dominated the discussion. Then she apologized for making an error in her presentation. And lastly, she acknowledged good questions.
Now, learners, remember that when you are asked to quote, please don't use your own words. Go back to the scenario and ensure that you actually use the words of the scenario. And you will see that when Ms. Stein went through the answer with you, all of those answers were in the scenario. Ms. Stein, let's move on to the next section. And this is where we are going to outline or explain the factors that must be considered by the presenter while presenting. So learners, this is important because now we are dealing with what happens during the presentation.
Okay, grade 12. So now you've prepared for your presentation, you're at the venue, and you are ready to present. So the first thing you must remember is to maintain eye contact, and that is very important. So you use hand motions and gestures to accent your vocal expression. If you feel that you are losing the attention, make them bigger and raise your voice slightly. Then, another word of advice, look at people who aren't looking at you and smile when they aren't and smile when they do acknowledge you. Next, use visual aids effectively. So visual aids can be used effectively in verbal presentations. Of course, it will then again reinforce what you are saying. They can be used to summarize the information in a visual way to make it memorable and meaningful. Okay, movement. It makes you look more confident because people who are nervous are generally frozen in one spot.
Okay, Ms. Stein, I'm going to just interrupt you for a moment there. It seems that WhatsApps are coming through fast and furiously, and they're coming through in on the telephone line here, and all the learners are welcoming Ms. Stein as a co-presenter, but we also have a number of learners who are from Philemon. Oh, that's a tongue twister. Philemon High School in Nditsani. And this learner says we are enjoying the session and we're learning stuff that we didn't know about presentations. Thank you. And so learners, we just want to remind you that in your matric year, this is your last term of business ventures, and we haven't quite gotten to presentation of information as yet, but you will be doing it very shortly. And so at that point, this will be good revision for you. Also, learners, I'm not sure if we're going to be able to get through to all of you and check with all of you and alert, attend to all of the comments and queries that are coming through on WhatsApp, but we will certainly try. And so now let us continue with presentation during the presentation. And so are we looking at movement?
We've looked at movement.
Okay, so we're looking at visiting the venue.
Okay, then next, don't speak too fast. So develop a slow presenting style. You'll be a more effective speaker. And of course, you have a big the audience you want to convey your message to. You have to then speak at a slower rate than what you do when you're having a conversation.
And you have to ensure that your audience is understanding the message that you're wanting to carry across. So by speaking at a fairly, I wouldn't say slow pace, but at a comfortable pace, you're giving them the opportunity to process the information, but you're also giving them the opportunity to stop you, should it be required. Okay, let's look at using pauses when necessary.
I think that's where pauses also come in, where you were saying you must speak at a comfortable pace.
So it gives them a chance to give you a question.
Of course.
Here and there. Okay.
Next slide.
And now we are looking at visual aids again, learners. And so maybe what you can do is, let's see if you can answer the question very quickly. So let's look at the question. This is a Section A type question, and it's a multiple choice one. And so here it is. The visual aid is not suitable in a presentation for 50 or more people. And on the screen, you have the options. And let's see what you guys have come up with. And so the options are A, PowerPoint, B, overhead projector, C, poster, and D, interactive whiteboard. And Ms. Stein, you will never believe it. We have something like 3, 5, or 6 correct answers, and well done to Port Alfred High School for getting the correct answer, and the answer is C. And learners, there are many more of you who got the correct answer. Well done to you. We'll try and acknowledge all of you. I must just say that these WhatsApps are coming in fast and furiously here. All right, let's continue. So the next section we are looking at now is how to design a multimedia presentation to include visual aids. Now, before I continue, I just want to say to the learners, you are complaining to me that we're moving a little bit too fast for you. But as I said at the beginning of the presentation, all of this information is available on the WCED e-portal. So please don't be upset. Don't try to write everything down. Just sit back and relax. Try to absorb the information and to gain something from it. You can always go to the WCED e-portal for business studies and retrieve the information from there. Now, our cognitive verbs about the multimedia presentation is discuss or explain. And so learners, this goes without saying, now you have to give a bit more information. You have to give substantial information. Remember, when you give a heading, ensure that you explain. And remember also to write all your facts in full sentences. That's the sure way to gain marks.
Okay, so what I usually tell my learners when we talk about the cognitive verb discuss is you gossip about the topic. You tell the examiner everything about that topic. And so now we will talk about everything on multimedia presentations. So you'll start off with a text. You translate the major headings in your presentation, outlined into titles for slides. Then what you do is bold bullet points by using short phrases, and remember please, only a maximum of 6 bullets per slide. Then you need to select a background. So adapt the colors based on where the presentation will be given. Use light text on a dark background for presentations in darkened rooms. Choose relevant images. Images should be used only to help your audience understand the message and to add interest. Select images that must complement the presentation. And of course here, you can also add videos, like YouTube videos, to make your multimedia presentation more interesting.
And also to portray additional information or to give some background. What I wanted to say about images, you could also use one image per slide and not necessarily have text, provided you choose the image correctly and suitably, and you can then unpack from there. So that's something that should be considered as well when doing that.
Okay, create graphs, and I think graphs summarizes information quite well. So to simplify complex information into a visually appealing graphic, that's when you create a graph. You can select from more than 12 chart types, including line, pie, and bar charts.
And it also tells the story. So depending on what type of graph you're going to select, it depends on how you would like to tell the story of the information contained in the graph.
And the audience can then capture it just by looking at one slide.
Yes, yes. And so learners, we are back to our consolidation question. Now, again, let's see how quickly you can get to the answer. And so the aspect should be considered when designing a multimedia presentation. And the options here are A, prepare the feedback session, B, cover a large amount of information, C, keep eye contact with the audience, and D, choose relevant images. And I wonder how many of you got the answer. So let's just look quickly. And the answer to this particular question is D. Let's continue, Ms. Stein. And so the next section. Now it's about responding to questions about work and presentations in a non-aggressive and professional manner. And so important, here we could also use the cognitive verb explain, which means that you would have to then break it down and give quite a bit of information.
Okay, so even when you're preparing your presentation, before you even presenting, think of all the possible questions that could be asked. So you prepare for questions, you read through your presentation, and you make a list of as many questions as you think you can.
Before we continue, Ms. Stein, here's a question from a student in Quincura in East London. And this student, 061-783-6790, wants to know how a visual aid is helpful to a presentation in a group of people.
It's like we said, Ms. Lewis. How is it helpful in a group of people, a visual aid? So instead of you just doing the oral presentation, the people can, or your audience will then obviously listen to you, but then they also have the reinforcement of the visual aid.
So whatever that particular visual aid is, be it a PowerPoint, be it a handout, if you've been there and you've been in the presentation, once you go away from that presentation, you have that handout or you have those PowerPoint slides, and you can then go back and refer to the information and in that way refresh your memory as to what was done in the presentation. I trust that you are satisfied with our response and our answer. And now let's continue with our present section.
Okay, limit question time. And we often find this in many presentations where the questions are endless. So limit the question time. This enables you not to exceed the allocated time for the presentation. If there are still people who want to ask questions, make yourself available afterward. Okay, so at the end of your presentation, you've done all this preparation. You've gone through your explanations during the presentation. Of course, people are asking very many questions. One can get stressed, so remain calm and remain open. So be aware of your body language. Do not fold your arms or put your hands on your hips in a defensive way.
Yeah.
Listen carefully to each question. So I think with listening comes thinking as well.
Yes.
Because you have to listen and then you have to think and then you have to answer. So write down the keywords of the question so that you don't forget the question. Be sure you know what you are being asked. Clarify the question if you don't understand it by repeating it to ensure that you have understood it.
And sometimes it happens that for all intents and purposes you listen very carefully but you still misinterpret that question. What can you do then? Just to ensure that you give the person asking the question the right answer.
Can you ask them to stand it over, or to ask the person to contact them at another time?
Yes.
So that you can think about the question at least.
And then give them the correct or most appropriate answer.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, and so the next would be to pause and consider your answer.
So pause and consider your answer. Take some time to pause before you launch into a response.
And why would that be so important?
Because you have to, again, think about your answer. You want to give the most appropriate answer.
And it also ensures that you're listening to the next question and you're giving yourself that breathing space just to regroup quickly and to listen and hear the audience asking you for the next one. Moving on to the next slide.
Answer clearly and calmly. Remain calm, speak audible, and keep responses brief. Because you don't want to go into a whole discussion because of all these questions that you are being asked.
And sometimes you end up rehashing your presentation again because you refer to certain sections in your presentation. Mm-hmm. But sometimes people in the audience just want to ask you that extra question too. And so it's important to be honest if you don't know the answer.
Okay, so if you don't know the answer, be honest admit if you do not know the answer to a question, offer to get back with an answer, and always deliver on your promise. So don't just say, I will answer you. Make good on your promise and then answer the person at a later stage. Okay, always remain polite, professional, and calm. So remain professional, polite, and calm when people ask questions to try to discredit you. Do not argue and become aggressive. Answer the question as best you can and move on.
Okay, now Ms. Stein, here's a question. And I think we've just covered this particular question. How do you respond to aggressive questions? And I think Ms. Stein covered that beautifully with a slide that's currently on the screen. But there's another question. And the question is, and it's from 4604522. And this person is asking, is it necessary to use visual aids for every presentation? Do you think? I would imagine that it's not always necessary, but it's. I think it would assist the presentation if there's a handout, especially if there are reminders and important dates that need to be to be considered. I think it would be important to use visual aids, but do you think it's important every time?
If you want to keep your audience, if you want to keep them gripped and listen to your presentation, I think it's very important, visual aids. Also, again, the person doesn't just listen to your talking all the time.
Yes.
They actually have something that they can look at. And as you say, after the presentation, there's something that you can fall back on and go and read up on that information again.
That is correct. And so let's look at the next slide. And so this is the one that deals with acknowledging errors that are made.
Okay, so acknowledge errors made. So be gracious in your response when someone alerts you to an error you made, and do not become defensive. Of course, sometimes you put in all this time and all this effort, and then people will come and you will see it as criticism, but I'm sure they're only trying to help when somebody alerts you to an error made. So apologize for the error and promise to provide everyone with the correct details.
That is correct. And that is also the answer to 7905947's question. And so we can now move on to the next section, and that is how to handle feedback and amend plans after the presentation. And so learners, let's look at that cognitive verb that says discuss how to handle feedback and amend plans after your presentation. And this simply means that for all of the information you're going to give, you need to state the concept as well as provide an explanation. So let's look at that. So constructive feedback is the only way to improve your presentation skills.
Okay, so feedback will inform the presenter about how the presenter came across, what the presenter did well, and where the presenter could improve. So after your presentation, immediate feedback is not always possible. People need to sit, they need to think about it, and moments later or hours later, they can think about useful things that you can use for future.
Yes.
to improve your presentation. I know with all the presentations that we do at the district or professional development, there's usually feedback or evaluation forms that we have to complete.
And that always gives you, there's always one question that says, how can we improve on what we've done?
Yes. And did you find the presentation or the training useful?
Yes.
And of course, then you can give valuable comments and feedback to the presenter.
That is correct. The next bullet in that particular section is you can also then learn how successful you were in delivering your message. Because sometimes you could have had a good presentation, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you delivered the message. And your audience is vital in alerting you to that via these evaluation forms or feedback forms.
Okay, and then of course, after success or if there were weaknesses, then you can make the necessary changes. Then the presenter should not become defensive when confronted with negative feedback. So always, if you're presenting, keep in mind, remain calm, remain open.
Watch the body language.
Yes.
Because body language gives you away very quickly. When one becomes defensive, you do certain things. When you become aware of yourself, when you become self-conscious, you do certain things. So watch the body language in that way. And the key then again is to remain calm, learners. When analyzing the feedback, what do you suggest we do?
So when we're analyzing feedback, we determine if there's truth in it. But of course, you're not only going to listen to one person's feedback. You're going to listen to a few people. And if there's similar things that they find, of course, then you know that you need to improve on it in the future. Okay, so what do you do when you receive negative feedback after a presentation?
So when you receive negative feedback, you can either ask more questions of the person so that you get more details about what they feel you did wrong. And sometimes it can be something small. Sometimes you just didn't acknowledge them enough, or you didn't take enough questions. And it's useful to just be reminded about those little things so that in the future, for future presentations, you remember to do it. You can also, when you get negative feedback, thank them for their input and then move on. And then moving to the slide again, analyze their comments later and decide if it's valid or if it's not valid, or if it requires drastic change or just a few small changes that you need to make. If the comment was valid, do something about it. And ensure that you then don't do it in the next presentation. Okay. Now we are looking at how to identify areas for improvement of a presentation. Now, this implies that we have done the presentation and that we want to improve it, so it's after. And again, we have the cognitive verbs of discuss and explain. And by now, learners, you know exactly what that means. It means that you now have to give as much information about this as possible. So, Ms. Sain, let's look at steps in improving a presentation.
Okay, so what do you do for your next presentation? How do you improve on the current presentation for the future? So you need to identify the strengths and the weaknesses of the presentation. Then list the weaknesses and write next to them suggestions for improvement. Write down all the suggestions and new perspectives provided for each of the weakness, and then incorporate all the new suggestions and improvements into the presentation. And I think this is so vital if you want to, as a person, if you want to improve for future presentations.
Yes, no, I agree with you fully. I must say, Ms. Sain, that the questions are coming through fast and furiously, and learners, a lot of you are asking the same questions. So when we are done with today's session and you have downloaded this material, just go back. All the answers are in the presentation, or just watch it once more. You will definitely find all the answers in the presentation. So now we're at the section where you need to make recommendations for future improvements based on feedback from presentations. Now, there are two new cognitive words here. The first being motivate, and the second is recommend. Recommend will never stand on its own, so it will always be make recommendations. Now, when you motivate or make recommendations, you have to give information. So please remember, write this in full sentences again, so that the reader or your teacher knows exactly what the recommendation is. So let's look at this.
Okay, so recommendations for future: shorten the presentation if it was too long, add more detail to the information if the presentation was too short, reorganize the flow of the slides if the presentation didn't flow in a logical sequence, consider the relevance of the non-verbal visual aids, Was the text appropriate and summarized adequately? And were the key points adequately addressed? Was the presentation visually appealing? And we've heard a lot about that today, about visual aids and making the presentation interesting.
Yes. And so we're at that point where we now have to look at essay questions, learners. Now, I know all of you love essay questions, so let's quickly look at it. Earlier, when I did the scenario-based question with you, I alerted you to the fact that there could be a scenario. So if you look on the screen, you will see that this particular essay question starts with a scenario. And this scenario is quite lengthy. And again, it's always a good idea to look at the actual question first before we read the scenario. So I've just put it up for you. And the important words, the cognitive verbs, outline, discuss, explain, elaborate, is in red. And also the content that you are looking for, designing a multimedia presentation, PowerPoint slides, overhead projector and handouts during his presentation, responding to questions. So now you have an idea of what you need to be looking for in the scenario. So let's quickly look at the scenario. It reads, wise man, a financial advisor, wants to present his business plan to various investors using a PowerPoint slideshow, an overhead projector, and handouts to enhance the quality of his presentation. He is not sure whether his presentation will be effective, as he has never done one before. He also lacks confidence in answering questions posed by the audience. Sure. That's a mouthful. But also, it has lots and lots of information and gives you lots and lots of clues. And so when you are going to look at the actual essay question, which I've just put up for you again, provide Wiseman with detailed information on the following. And then you will see there are 4 bullets. Now, learners, we all know that there's a specific essay structure that you have to use when you are writing an essay and answering the essay question. So remember that the structure remains the same. You still have to write your introduction with your 2 sentences. And remember, you must write the word introduction. Then it will follow your 2 sentences. And because the topic is presentation of information, the introduction will be about this particular topic. Please don't write about forms of ownership because it has nothing to do with this topic. Stick to presentation of information and it can be anything that introduces this particular topic. Then, in the main section of your essay, there are 4 bullets there. And each of those 4 bullets need to appear as paragraphs in your essay answer. Just for ensuring that you have 4 paragraphs that focus on what is asked here. Designing the aspects that must be considered when designing a multimedia presentation. The advantages of PowerPoint, overhead projector and handouts as visual aids. Factors that should be considered or kept in mind during the presentation. Aspects that should be considered when responding to questions in a professional and non-aggressive manner, just for making sure that you have those 4 paragraphs with content below it, means you will get 1A, and that 1A is 1 analysis mark. And in order to get the second analysis mark, as you can see on the screen, you need to have 16 or more facts about this information. So, Ms. Stein, let's look at a typical introduction for presentation of information.
So just remember, grade 12s, the very first thing that we look at is your structure. When I'm marking, I look, does the learner have an introduction? Do they have a conclusion? Do they have a body? Already you get marks awarded for that. I mean, we can already award you 2 A's. So we need to see the word introduction and not intro, the full word introduction, and then 2 sentences under that. And like Mrs. Lewis said, it must pertain to presentation of information in this case.
And just to correct you, just structure. Well, the correct structure, introduction, the main section and the conclusion will already give you your 2 L's.
The 2 L, sorry, and not A's.
Okay, so now let's quickly look at the middle section that will give you your A's. So aspects for designing a multimedia presentation is the first part. And so you would need to use legible font or font size on whatever it is you're going to use, whether it's PowerPoint or a poster. Start with the text. You're going to need to keep the language simple, keep the text and images simple and as concise as possible. Create clear or relevant graphics. So if you're deciding to use your pie graph or any of your bar charts, remember it needs to be clear and visible. And add special effects, for example, your sound, your animation, or even your video, if that is what you choose to use. Ensure that you write every new fact on a new line. Write in full sentences because this will definitely give you the opportunity to score marks. And say what you mean. Write exactly what you mean, learners. Don't keep the reader guessing. Write exactly what it is that you mean so that you can qualify for the maximum marks.
And
Sorry?
And also, Mrs. Lewis, just to remind the learners, don't write nothing.
Yes.
Write something under your readings.
I agree with you. If all of you know something about this, as you said earlier, everybody has done presentations. You've had to do it for term 2. So all of you have done something, and even if you forget, just write what you know. At some point, it may be relevant. Let's quickly look at the advantages of PowerPoint slides, Ms. Stein.
Okay, so the advantages of PowerPoint slides. Graphic programs have the capacity to convey ideas and support what the presenter says. Easy to combine with sound and video clips. And here, the advantages of PowerPoint slides and all the other media that the question asked for, we don't know when we are marking or before we are marking, when you write your exam, how many facts the learner must write. So it's always, I think, a wise thing I tell my learners to write as much information as what you can.
I think the clue, Ms. Stein, is, if you look at the slide that we have in front of us, you are writing about the advantages of multimedia visual aids. So you haven't been asked to write a specific number. When you have been left like that, to just write advantages, write as much as you possibly can. Because when they say write 2 advantages of PowerPoint slides, you are only limited to those 2 points. Because only 2 points will be marked. So I think that's important for learners to note that where there is no number specified, you write as much information as you possibly can. Where the number is specified, you only give the requested number.
Yeah.
Moving on to the advantages of the overhead projector.
So the advantages of an overhead projector, I don't know, we don't use overhead projectors anymore. We just use data projectors. Do you still use?
Now and again, I still use an overhead projector if there's nothing available. Not all schools are resourced in the same way. And so it's not always possible to use PowerPoint.
Okay.
And so when an overhead projector is available, it's important because remember you have to prepare the transparencies way ahead of time. You can't just walk in and expect that it's going to happen.
Yes.
And so it is possible, but you have to do your planning very well and you have to keep your points very concise because the space is quite limited.
On the overhead.
On the overhead. And the advantages of handouts.
So, advantages of handouts. Meaningful handouts may be handed out at the start of the presentation to attract attention. But I find when I did a presentation, once you give that handout, and we're only looking at advantages now, people stay focused on that handout.
Yeah.
So, notes or hard copies of the slide presentation can be distributed at the end of the presentation as a reminder of the key facts of the presentation.
Factors to be considered during a presentation. And learners, I hope that you are taking note of all of the breaking down of the body of this essay, because we are covering them each systematically as it is in the question. And remember, if you cover all of them, you only get your first A. So the factors to be considered during the presentation.
Okay, so wise men must make eye contact, as we said before, with the audience and look in all directions. Be audible to all listeners and the audience or the audience. He should adjust his voice level or tone to avoid monotony, and then also use visual aids effectively to enhance the presentation.
Something else that you should consider doing in your presentation is you will obviously have subtopics as your presentation goes along to provide the flow and the logical sequencing of your presentation. So that's a good idea. And obviously the visuals will be linked to those headings that you are going to add. And I just added that information, Miss, because there was a question. A learner seemed to need a bit of clarity on that, and it just so happened it was appropriate at that particular time. And so, aspects to consider when responding to questions in a professional or non-aggressive manner. Let's look at those quickly.
So, wise men should stand throughout the feedback session. You should be polite, confident, courteous when responding to questions. Wise men should first listen, then respond. You should keep answers short and to the point. You should always address the questions and not the person.
And then we reach the conclusion. So by this time, learners, we assume that you have covered all 4 of the bullets that are in the essay question. You have written your introduction, and so you are ready to conclude your essay. And you're going to conclude your essay with 1 sentence. And you can say something like, a good presentation promotes the image of business or the owner or management. All the best. Work hard until we next see you. Thank you very much.